I'm Justin Davis, and this is Drone Camps RC. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Drone Camps channel. Thanks for supporting me and everybody else in the FPV community that's making awesome content for you guys. My Patreon is down below. If you think that this video helps you today and it helps you repair your quad, that's awesome. I would love to have you as a Patreon supporter. $1 or more. I'm trying to get up to that $1,000 level, so that would be super awesome if you did that. All this information today is going to help you repair a quad that you had a problem with. Say one of your motors stopped working, or you have your 4-in-1 ESC go out, or you had a flight controller just totally take a dump on you. We're going to show you how to fix that. We're going to break this quad down. The most intimidating part of repairing a quad is just getting started with it, and you're afraid that you might mess something up. So we're going to help you out with that. I'm going to show you how I take this one apart. It's a very standard 4-bolt on top situation. We have some 4 bolts on the sides here, and we actually do have one of the motors bad and one of the ESCs bad in this quad. So this is going to be a perfect example for me to just break this down for you and then repair it, put it back together, and show that it does indeed work. So we're going to do that process for you today. We're going to walk you through that, and hopefully that will help you repair your quad, because we're going to show you everything that you need to do all the way through this process, from the 4-in-1 ESC replacement up to the flight controller. And we're going to use very standard components on this. This is the HGLRC 35 amp BL Heli ESC. This is a 4-in-1 ESC. You can find these two in the links down below. If you want to grab a couple of these are the ones I'm going to suggest. And this is the HGLRC Airbus F4, also with Betaflight OSD. You can upgrade this one to the latest Betaflight 3.5, and has supports all the way up to a 6S battery. So this would be quite an upgrade for your quad. Just make sure that your motors can handle 6S if you decide to put a 6S battery on this configuration, because it will handle it. It's a very nice ESC setup. But also gotta say thanks to Scorpion Power sent us a couple batteries to test out for you guys on the channel. I'm gonna let you know what I think about these Scorpion batteries. They're 4S75C 1300s. They do have a little balance port here. XT60 is already on there, very standard. So I'm gonna slap some Velcro on the back of these and possibly put this on this Hobbymate quad here that I'm repairing. And we will test those out next week for you guys, and possibly over the weekend. But I'm also going to show you guys the tools that you need that are pretty important to have in your arsenal on your bench. This is a solder remover tool. You can get these down at the link below. I'm going to try to find one of these and post this for you. This is like $5. But everybody that builds race quads should have one of these on their bench, because it's super important for pulling off blobs of solder on the quad. Very, very important tool. And will clean up your boards quite a bit if you just get a little bit too much solder going. Really big pulls of solder can be bad, because they can float over to the next tab and cause a short on your board. So also going to recommend a smoke stopper. You can find one of those down at the link below. Those are also very awesome. It just plugs in the back of the quad right here between your battery and the quad. And when you plug in your battery for the first time after you've done your repair, if the light lights up on that little smoke stopper, that means that you have some type of issue where you have a short, and you have possibly an open wire touching another spot on the board. If it makes a connection, a bad connection, you'll see a puff of white smoke. And after a repair, that's never a good thing to see. So a smoke stopper is very important. Another important tool, and a TS100. If you don't have a TS100 soldering iron yet, you need to get one of these, because it powers off a 4S 1300. You can take it out in the field, and most of us are now using the TS100 as my bench iron. Mine is sitting over here to my left, and I'm going to use that during this whole entire video. And I should be able to do an entire build with one 4S battery sitting on the bench. I don't even have to plug it into the wall. So very cool. But let's go ahead, now that you've got prepped, and hopefully you have made an order of these two, and we can go ahead and get started repairing this 5-inch race quad and get it back up and running. Here we go. Okay, so before we get started with this video, you're gonna need some basic things to repair your quad. This is probably one of the most important things. This is the TS100 portable soldering iron that works off a 4S1300 battery. It already comes with a little XT60 connector right there and a barrel plug on this end. So if you want to break it down even further, this little pin tip right here also comes off. You can get replaceable tips for these. These are really great to own, and the tips are actually pretty cheap to buy. So I'll go ahead and plug this back in, and if I plug it into the no hype battery that I have sitting here, so thanks to Henry Witherspoon for giving me one of those to test for you guys. You guys can probably check them out in the link below too if I remember to put his link down there. Hopefully I do. If I do forget, please remind me. So I press start there, and it just starts to heat up, and this will melt solder in about right around 15 to 20 seconds. So this is a pretty fast soldering iron. Now, one of the other things I'm going to recommend if you guys don't have one of these yet is a fume extractor. A fume extractor can be bought several ways. You can buy the really expensive Hacko fume extractor, which is essentially a big box with a carbon filter that sucks the solder fumes into it, and you replace that carbon filter every once in a while. It is a little bit noisy to run. It's kind of like a large fan, but it doesn't leave any smoke residue in the room where you're working. So that's very nice. You can also get hood versions of these as well, which mount to the top of your bench and suck the smoke up. That way it doesn't go into your face and into your lungs. You can also get other versions of desktop ones that just kind of suck the smoke away from you. Of course, the fumes would still be in the room that you're working in, but try to work somewhere that's kind of ventilated. That's pretty important. Now, some of the other tools that you're going to need is you're going to need some 6040 solder. I'm going to put a link down below for that as well. And you will need some type of Phillips head, little miniature Phillips head screwdriver. These are important usually for the little screws on the side of your run cams, or they can also be these little 1.5 millimeter hex driver right here. So the hex driver bolts can be on the side of those, and I believe they've actually upgraded to the M3 style bolts, so you also might need an M3 hex driver. So most of the hardware on most of the race quads are M3 and M2 bolts. So this will probably be my primary driver today, will be the M3. And also, if you have props on your quad, make sure you use your ratchet tool or your driver tool and go ahead and remove those props off your quad. Anytime you're working indoors, you always want to remove your props. Very important that you do that. But I think we have everything ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my fume extractor, and we're going to start breaking this quad down on the bench here. We're going to pop the top first. That's going to be your first step. Just these 4 bolts right here are going to come off. And you know, if you're watching this video, hopefully on your large screen TV, where you can really see what goes on in this build or this tear down and repair, this can really help you. Even if you have different components, this is really going to help you understand how this process goes and make it a little less stressful for you. I know when you're first getting started, it's always really kind of terrifying to think about taking something that partially works completely apart to repair something. So once we pop the top on here, and it has 2 little front mounts there, carbon posts for the camera, it's going to move that over to the side. And if you have your antenna like I have here, I'm just going to bring it a little closer. There's a few zip ties there holding my antenna on that sort of horizontal mount situation that I have going. If you have a race quad, make sure you do a horizontal mount like this, so if it hits, it's not vertical mounted. Vertical mount is always going to break your antenna off in the really hard impacts. So I don't have to remove any of those zip ties on that top plate. All I have to do right there is unplug my MMCX connector from my VTX. So I'm just going to pop that off, and then I can remove the whole thing. So we're just going to set that to the side. I don't need that for right now. And now I'm going to go ahead and clear off the bench for you, and we'll go ahead and break this thing down. And we're going to remove some of the wires on this, and we're going to get a new ESC on there first, and then we'll work on the flight controller, and then we'll work on the VTX and the camera after that, as well as the receiver. Okay, so now we're ready to start taking down the stack and removing parts and components here. One pretty important thing is to make sure that you organize the screws and the bolts that you remove. Now the way that I usually do it is I just push them to the side on my work mat so that they're all right there when I go to put things back. The other way you can do that is a cleaner version of this. One of these little magnetic trays are great to just throw your bolts in so that when you're working on a particular build that they don't wander or fall off your bench. Once these little tiny bolts fall off your bench, they're kind of hard to find if you have carpet in your shop. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this around to the side. I'm not going to use this because it's just full of my razor blades and my test prop. I use a little 3-inch prop, by the way, when I'm doing my motor direction test, and I just remove the very top nut on the motor, and I test one motor at a time in Betaflight. And if this little guy, it doesn't have a nut on the top, so it's not going to flip the quad over, and this has flown off a few times, but it's so lightweight it's not going to hurt anything. And most of the time when I do the motor test, it spins freely around the shaft, so I can see when it comes to a stop which way it's actually spinning. So that is a step in this process that's going to be quite far down the line. So the next process that we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead, and if you have a VTX, and a lot of these are in a lot of builds here lately, these top mount VTXs, if you have a top mount VTX stack, go ahead and remove your 4 bolts on the very top of your VTX, whatever VTX you're using. And you want to set those to the side, set that hardware to the side. Sometimes those little plastic nuts will kind of fall down into the stack. You can shake the quad out and just have that come out wherever it fell in. Now I'm going to take this one off here, and we're going to set those over to the side. And one did fall down there, so I'm just going to try to locate that. There it is. It fell out right there. Just going to set that in my stack over there, my stack of little standoff nuts. Now we're going to remove the camera. So you should have one camera harness that is going from your flight controller over to your camera. So go ahead and unplug your camera now, and we're going to set the camera to the side. I don't need to disconnect the camera for anything there. We might have to resolder some of the camera wires to the next flight controller, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But we're going to go ahead now and remove the VTX. So just pull your VTX off, and it is soldered onto this other side right here, and they have quite a camera harness going here for this. So all we really have to do is probably just power this up, and we will investigate that setup later. For now, what I might do is just go ahead and snip those wires and remove this from this particular setup. You can snip them off wherever they're soldered onto your flight controller at this point, and we can come back, and I'm going to show you how to fix this coming up later in the video, how to resolder on your VTX, and maybe we'll use a different VTX and we can solder things straight to the flight controller a little bit later, and that's going to be pretty easy to do. So set your VTX to the side, and now we can see the flight controller is there. We have the receiver wire is coming over the top right here, and the next thing you're going to do is just remove the 4 standoffs. And if you didn't have a VTX stacked on top of your flight controller, you're probably likely just going to have these little plastic nuts. So just go ahead at this point and remove those 4 plastic nuts and set those to the side. This is standard M3 plastic standoffs, and I'll try to put a link to a kit of these down below, because these are awesome to have. They come in these little plastic boxes, and you can get tons of these to have extra. These are always nice to have, just a little box of these sitting to the side here. So they do have 4 rubber grommets here on the very top for dampening this flight controller, which is really nice. And this is great that I get to use this one as a demo for you guys, because this one came in with a problem. Sometimes that happens. You get something from China or somewhere, and it has an issue right when you plug in your battery for the first time. Even if it's a bind and fly, this stuff can happen. So I've had several companies send me things that just had one little mistake, and then you have an issue. So now we're going to go ahead, and if you want to, you can take your soldering pin and you can remove these 3 wires for your receiver. Let me just go ahead and zoom in a little more so you can see what we're doing here. I hope you guys are enjoying this new 4K camera that we're shooting with, so you can really see what's going on here. And I'll just go ahead and plug in my TS100 here. And we're going to put the LiPo as far away from the end of this tip as possible. I don't want a catastrophe. You do not want this tip to touch any battery on your bench. So usually while I'm working, I usually have my soldering iron way away from any LiPo source. So go ahead and press this, and it's going to start heating up. I love this iron. Now, one other thing you're going to need on your bench while you're doing this process is some type of steel wool that you can clean off the tip in. Very important that you do that. And I'm just going to go ahead and start up my Hakko fume extractor here, so you might hear a little bit of noise. But I'm going to turn it off as soon as we're done with this step. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off the tip. And now I'm going to take a little bit of solder, and we're going to add just a little bit of solder to the tip there, and it's going to suck that smoke away from me, away from my face. Now I'm going to go ahead and touch it down to the signal wire. We're going to pull that signal wire off, the red wire and the black wire. So that was the neat way to do it. The quick way to do it is to I'm going to clean that solder tip again, and I'm going to unplug the wire, the barrel connector, as well as the XT60 connector from the battery here. I'm going to set my TS100 to the side somewhere so it's not burning anything. I'll turn this off. Yeah, so the quick way would just be to use your snips and snip that off, because you can just pinch these wires and solder them on later. Now we have, most likely, you do have some type of signal harness coming up from your 4-in-1 ESC, and that will be somewhere on your flight controller. So just go ahead and remove that now, and we're going to set this board to the side. There's nothing wrong with this flight controller on this particular quad. So I had an issue with the 4-in-1 ESC down here. I actually had one of the ESCs bad, so we're going to use that HGLRC 35 amp ESC setup here. So now I'm going to go ahead and snip this, because that is kind of holding the receiver down, and my receiver is all ready to remove. They do have a little piece of VHB under it right there. I can just pop that off. Now I'm just going to remove that VHB. And if you're using a smoke stopper, which you should be, I'm going to go ahead and remove this battery wire zip tie right there. And now's a good time. I'm just gonna, actually we're just gonna leave those there, because all we're gonna do is put this back up there. So you don't have to remove where your antennas are going out on the arms. Like I was saying a second ago, if you have any of these terminals right here touching, this is one of the most important parts and important steps of building your race quad. If you built one yourself and you have 2 tabs touching here, your smoke stopper is going to light up, and you're going to see that you have some type of connection somewhere, and it could be from these 2 tabs right here where your battery terminals are. I just helped someone yesterday who had a bunch of frayed wires hanging out from his 2 battery connection terminal points. So very important that you don't make the mistake to have just one little tiny wire touching over on the negative side here, or vice versa, because you'll have an issue where you'll have a short, and that light will light up in your smoke stopper. If you're not using a smoke stopper, you might get the puff of white smoke, and your 4-in-1 ESC will be done before you ever get started, and you'll have to buy a new one. So don't make that mistake. But let's go ahead now, and I'm going to fire up the TS100 again, and you're going to remove the, let's see if I can get these rubber grommets off. You're going to remove the standoff hardware from your 4-in-1 ESC. I try to be really meticulous with all of my little parts piles, so when I go back to get them later, they're all in the same spot. And they have metal posts that go all the way through this stack, so this is kind of a nice setup. These metal posts are really solid, and the point of these metal posts that are holding this entire stack is the fact that if you have a hard crash or a bump, that if you had used a plastic type of setup, meaning like plastic standoffs, using these to stack them up all the way up through the top, that this little part could break. And a lot of times it's much more solid build if you use the taller metal posts like they have here. So this was a very good design from HobbyMate. And we do have a review of a HobbyMate quad on the channel coming up. If they can get that quad to me quick enough, I will do it sooner. So if they're watching this video, make sure you guys send that quad out as quick as you can. They were nice enough to send me a replacement quad, but since I have this one, I figured I would do this repair video for you guys, because this is kind of important information for people to know. And that's the whole point of drone camps, is to teach others and move the information forward so you guys can have a better experience than I did getting into this. I spent a lot of time at a friend's garage learning a lot of this step by step from him, and also a lot of this on my own, making my own mistakes. Now, if it makes it easier for you, I'm just going to back this up a little bit. If it makes it easier for you to remove these 4 outside posts, you can do that. If you have any other type of side plates on your quad, it's a good time to go ahead and do this. Now I have total access to these tabs right here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove the motor wires. That's going to be the next step in this repair process. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my soldering iron again and use my no hype battery there. Little shameless plug for Henry Witherspoon. Very nice guy, and he has some awesome batteries coming out. I kind of like the name No Hype. It's pretty cool. Nobody likes unintentional hype in the industry. So that's plugged in, and we're going to go ahead and start up the iron. Look how fast that thing heats up. Look at that. It's already up to 143, 175 C. So when it gets up to 400 C, this thing is totally ready. But once it gets past 250 C, I can go ahead and clean the tip off. And I'm going to turn on the Hakko fume extractor again over here. Let's get that a little bit closer. And one thing you also want to be aware of when you're doing builds, I just pushed some of these bolts and they came close to the motor. If you get one of these little tiny bolts up inside the motor, when you go to start up your motor, it could short out. So you want to be super careful that you don't, before you fire up your quad, make sure that none of those bolts on the bench came close to your motors, because they do have magnets in them and they'll suck those right up into the motor. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the fume extractor, and I'm going to start removing these motor wires. So you're just going to do this one at a time. If you have some type of tweezers, that really helps pull the motor wire back from the tab. So I will just go ahead and you want to have a little bit of solder on the end of your pin, because that really makes it, the heat transfer better. Solder helps transfer the heat from the pin to whatever tab you're trying to remove. So we're going to go ahead, and it only takes a second with this Hakko. This is really awesome. If I can get this tweezers on there, and be really careful when you're removing solder points on these, because sometimes the solder will actually splash and it can fly up into your face. I've had hot solder hit me right close to my eyeballs. Not cool. Kind of sucks to get hit in the face with hot solder, or anywhere else hot solder might come in contact with your skin, it burns like hell. Yeah, it sucks. I'm sure most of you guys have burned your hands, your fingers. I've actually stuck my soldering pin into my arm. I have a scar on my arm from my soldering pin. It's quite impressive. You guys might be able to see it right here in my wrist right there. I'm a little bit hairy, so it's kind of hard to see, but there it is. So now I have 2 motor wires removed. Okay, now you're going to do the other side. Now hopefully you guys can hear me over that fume extractor. And you're just going to do this one at a time. You can go back and clean the tip in between each wire that you remove. It'll just make it flow a little bit better. I can just clean that up a little bit, add a little more solder to the end of the TS100. It just transfers the heat better. And if I can get my tweezers on there, okay, I'm going to lift that up. And now the next one. And I'm also going to remove the XT60 battery lead there. I guess I could use the new one that comes along with the HGLRC ESC combo, which is great because they do give you the wires. Super awesome. And I'll just keep working these wires one by one. And this post is in the way a little bit. I'm just going to leave those posts there for now. We're probably going to remove them. Speaking of the stack posts, by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so now I have all 4 removed. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the fume extractor. We're going to unplug this and set it far away from my battery. Usually I have my battery sitting a couple feet from where I'm building, so I don't make the mistake of putting the iron down right on top of the battery and having a huge fire on my bench. Okay, so now you should have all of your motor wires removed, and now you can just slide this off. This is the bad ESC, for example. I don't need any of this gear on here because we're going to use the new HGLRC 35 amp stack. And be careful to look at the direction of the front of your quad and the back of your quad, because you don't want to put your ESC on backwards or upside down. Super important about making this repair. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this HGLRC 4-in-1 ESC, and you can find the link for this one down below. We also have a capacitor to solder on the back if we want to. We have an XT60 there. We have all of our standoffs here. And I might actually just keep these on here. If you want to use the standoffs that came with it, this does have some longer screws that can go through the bottom of your quad's frame. If your quad is too thick, like this one is, to use this longer screw in here to come up, you can use the hardware that you already have on there. So since this quad is actually too thick from here to here to get those posts through there, these will be much sturdier, by the way. And we also have some battery wires there, which is great. And I'm going to set all this stuff to the side. And we do have a schematic for the layout here. You don't have to put this harness on just yet, but it will go right into this port right here. And you're just going to make sure that when you plug it in that you have the teeth aligned to the right way. We're just going to find the very top of it, what looks to be the very top of this ESC stack. We'll see which way it goes. And the way you do that is you're going to look at your ESC close up. I'm going to try to get this in focus for you guys now. You want to find where it says M1, 2, 3, and 4 there. So I don't see it on that side, and I do see numbers on this side. So we'll see a 1 there, 2, 3, and 4. Those are your motor orders. So right turn rear, if you're doing it a traditional quad setup like in Betaflight, that's going to be right turn rear. So we know that this is the very back because we have the battery terminals back there, and this will be the front. So it's actually going to face up just like this. And later you're going to plug in this harness right here, and you're going to see here that the teeth are facing up. And you could go ahead and do this now if you want to, it doesn't matter. We can have those sitting off the front. They're not in the way at all. So then you're going to take this, and we already have rubber grommets underneath here, and this is great. Stay out of the way, receiver, please. There we go. So facing forward on this quad, and we're going to go ahead and seat that down just like that. There's a little bit of play in there, but once I put these dampeners, or if I put this other hardware on the top, it's going to hold it in place. Now what's nice about these ESC tabs right here is that these are well away from the posts. Sometimes they're a little bit close to the post and it makes it hard to work on. I would probably just go ahead and maybe just put one piece of hardware on there at this point, just to hold the ESC in place. And what you can do is we're going to swap this to the other side when we do this side. So the first section of this, we're going to do this side here because it's the side closest to me. We're just going to add solder to each tab, and once we add solder to each tab, we can start putting the motor wires back on. So we're going to tin those. Now we're going to go ahead and fire up the TS100 again. I have that sitting here, and I have my no hype battery. And you're also going to heat up your battery terminal tabs back here, and we're going to add some solder to those back there. And we're gonna prep those, and I'm going to show you how to solder up an XT60 battery connector as well. I use a device called a Mr. Jig, and it just holds that XT60 in there like this, so I can get those motor wires soldered in there. It also has little tiny bullet connector type ports there if you want to do it that way, and it also has an XT30 spot. So these things are awesome. I'll try to put a link down below for the Mr. Jig. This thing is just really cool to have. You know, you heat these up and put your heat shrink over these and plop them right down in there. But you can do your heat shrink after it if you want. So let's go ahead and set that to the side and get some heat going to this TS100. You guys got some music going while you're watching this video, hopefully. I always like to build with music, but I can't put any music in my videos because they won't let me monetize it if I do that. Alright, so we're already heated up. Damn those copyright laws, you know what I mean? So let's go ahead and turn on the fume extractor again, and we'll go ahead and take a moment to zoom in for you, and I'll show you how these will get tinned up for our motor wires. You want to clean your tip first. Go ahead and move all your motor wires out of the way so you can get to your tips, and go ahead and put just a little bit of solder on the end of your TS100, and you're going to hold the solder down to the tab, and you're just going to dip the solder up against the side of your pin as you're holding it there, and you only need to do this for maybe about 10 seconds per tab. And you want to rub the tip of your iron around on the pad to distribute the heat all along the pad. If you didn't get a nice little bubble of solder, you can see there on both of those look pretty good. You want to just add a little bit of solder, and you can do this over if you do something like that where you didn't get enough solder on there. You want a nice little pool of solder in there. You don't want too much. Don't overdo it, because then you're going to have solder bridging to things on your 4-in-1 ESC, and you don't want any solder off these tabs touching anything else, any other chips like right there. And you can use a magnifying glass to go back in and inspect these tabs. I really recommend those magnifying glasses that have they're sort of like a bench style magnifying glass. Normally older folks use them to read, or most people use them for building, and that way you can see that there's absolutely nothing touching right there. So all those look good. Now we're going to flip it around the other way. And I'm just going to move those out of the way there. Okay, those motor wires out of the way. All right, we're still rocking. You see, this is not too hard, is it? You just want to rub. Make sure you get plenty of heat down on that pad. Don't overdo it. If you overdo it, you're going to separate the pad from the ESC. You don't need to push super hard. Okay, that looks pretty good. Might go back and do this one again because I don't like the way that looks. Okay, that looks better. If your solder looks dull after you pull your pin away, it means that you got a cold solder. So very important that you have a shiny ball of solder on your pad. Otherwise you could have just the solder would just fall off. That means you didn't get a good connection. Now I forgot to move that standoff over to the other side, so be pretty careful when you're putting this heat next to these standoffs, because you can melt these standoffs super easy, but it looks like I didn't do it there. So now all of our solder points look pretty good. Let's check those out a little bit closer. Those look pretty damn good. Not bad, Justin. So now we're going to do the next step in the process. We're going to put some heat to the back battery terminals there. And I'm just going to move these motor wires out of the way again. And this time we're going to use quite a bit more solder. And you can go ahead and take this opportunity to clean off the tip on your TS100. And we're going to start adding all kinds of solder and see how it's pulling up there. I'm just going to keep spreading the heat around on the tab and let go, and it should look something like that. I'll just bring it in a little bit closer for you guys so you can really see what's going on there. I want to say thanks to HDLRC again for sending me these components. And when you're making these solders, there's a flat part of your TS100 that should be sitting resting flat on the tab on your terminals and on your motor wire terminals here. You want to, there's this little tiny flat part right here. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's not focusing. You want to have that flat on the pad. That makes all the difference to transferring the heat. If you're using just the very sharp tip, you're not going to get a good heat transfer. So now it looks like that is good to go. Also, we're going to recommend that you guys get some type of helping hands, and you can get them from Harbor Freight. I would try to get the ones that are like the more name brand ones. This one here, I can't remember what the name of it is. I've had this one for years, but this is great. So we're going to set the quad to the side because now we're going to work on the battery terminals. Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and we're going to tin the battery wires, and you want to just put your TS100 on the edge of the battery wire like this. And what you're going to do here is, if you have a set of a magnifying glass with a light on it, you can kind of see close into what you're doing. If you don't have that, don't worry about it. You want to just run the tip around the wire and keep the heat transferring to the wire. This is pretty thick gauge wire, so the trick of this is to get the solder to flow in between the smaller pieces of wire that make up the hole. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to keep transferring the heat from your TS100 to that wire. It's awesome if you have helping hands to help this process, and just keep running that TS100 around your wire and around it, back up around to the front. Keep adding a little bit of solder as you go. If you get it to where you have too much on there and it drips down below, try to clean that up a little bit. You want to have it pretty flush with the edge of the wire. You might have a little excess. You can just pull that excess off with the TS100 tip and go ahead and clean that off. And one of the tricks of doing this is to just add a little bit of solder on your iron right where you're moving it around the wire, and that will help transfer the heat. And once the wire is hot enough, you'll know that it's hot enough once you start to dip the wire on the other side of the, or that you dip the solder on the other side of the wire right here. It should start to melt. See how it's not melting yet? When it does start to melt, that means my wire has reached the temperature that I need it to be for tinning this wire. So there we go, it's starting to melt now. Now I'm just going to keep that solder pin flowing there, put a little more on the tip there. Make sure that your solder tip is not dry, that you do have some solder on the tip there. And now that's looking pretty good. And just bring a little more on the front there. And now we're ready to work with the XT60. So go ahead, if you have one of these jigs, this helps from you not to burn your fingers. These are great. I'll try to find some link down below for you to put down there for one of these. These are awesome. You're gonna put XT60 on this side right here, crank that down, and you can also put an XT30 on here if you want on this side, and they have bullet connector points on the top part right there. So if you're doing motor wires, you can just set your bullet connector down in there and run your wire right on top of it. So we're gonna put this in there, and we're gonna do the positive side first. You have to be really careful when you're doing this so that you don't heat these for too long, because it'll melt the plastic on your XT60 connector, which really sucks. So the first step is to go ahead and feed a little bit of solder in here until it pulls up like this, and you should see that it looks about like this. It shouldn't be blobbing up above the connection point too much. If you get a bubble in there, it will probably not be enough solder. Once you put your wire down in there, you'll have kind of a loose connection if you don't put enough solder down in these terminals. So you're going to add a liberal amount, but not too much, so it's not bubbling out over the sides. And the first wire I always do is the red wire. And the positive side of an XT60 is usually going to be the flat side. So as you can see right here, I'm just going to zoom in a little closer so you guys can see this to make sure you absolutely do this correct. See that flat side right there? That is the side that we're going to solder up first. And you're just going to come in from the vertical perspective, and I trim this wire back a little bit. And if you see one side of your wire that doesn't have a good amount of solder on it, a good tin going, you could probably do that over. You want to make sure that you have plenty of solder all the way around this wire. Otherwise, we might not have a good connection. So just going to keep applying some heat to that. I'm going to add a little bit more on there because I don't like the way that tin turned out. And these jigs are awesome because I can sit here and do something like this right on the side of it because it's metal. If you have too much on there, you can get rid of the excess, but that's starting to look pretty good. You should see it start to sizzle. And once you have this wire nice and hot, it's a good time to go ahead, start applying some heat to the XT60 terminal. And this is the trick right here. You're going to need to put enough heat to both of these pieces of metal at once, and then really quickly put this in there and get it seated. And you want to make sure the wire is touching the metal terminal. And you don't want to do it for too long because you'll actually have the terminal slide down and forward, and it'll ruin your connector. You can heat it back up and do it over, push the terminal back out, but it's a real pain in the butt to do that. So you want to give it a little bit of a tug there. That's looking pretty good. I do have a little bit of a blob on the side there. I could probably clean up a little bit here. You don't want to touch it for very long. And sometimes these won't be perfect. You might have to pull it out and do it over, which is totally not a bad thing, but that's looking pretty good. And don't pull in your wire too soon because even 5 seconds after you do this, it can still be quite wet. And sometimes these will turn around like this. It's not a big deal, as long as it doesn't pull back. So that's still seated nice. We're going to put heat shrink over that, but we're going to go ahead and do the negative side. And that's usually going to be the domed side of the XT60 connector. I'm going to go ahead and grab my black wire, and I can use the side of this again, the side of this And I'm going to use the long side here, the long side of my wire. You could definitely use a cleaning right there and add a little bit more solder to the tip. And we're just going to put it down on the metal there, and we're going to try to make sure that this is nice and hot. This wire needs to be sizzling quite good. And the reason that we're doing the wire first is because you don't want to put all this heat to the terminal until you're really sure that this wire is hot, because this wire takes a long time to heat all the way up. Because if you put too much heat to this terminal, it will melt where it's seated in the plastic, and then it's going to move, and that's going to be a problem. And before we do that, before we touch it to the terminal, I'm just going to add some more solder there to the tip. And now we should be ready to transfer this over. It's looking pretty good. I see some sizzle starting to happen there. Now we're just going to bring it close here. I'm just going to get this on there like this, and we're going to heat up the terminal and the wire at the same time. When you feel it start to slip down in there, you can go ahead and push it vertical. And now it should be hot enough on both pieces of metal. Make sure that your wire is touching the terminal. That's really important. So now I'm holding it there for another 5 to 10 seconds, and I can go ahead and let go, clean off my tip again, and I'm going to go ahead and take this out of here. Okay, so now what you want to do is you want to just tug on both of these wires to make sure that they're seated properly, and inspect this side right here. Make sure that you don't have either one of these moving forward. Now go ahead and grab your piece of heat shrink. I have a piece here that's going to fit over both of those wires. So I'm going to go ahead and snip that in half. And we're going to put one side on. And the frays don't matter as much on your XT60 side as much as they do the other side, where it's going to solder onto the ESCs, because if you have frays here and they touch, you'll have a short, so be careful about that. Now go ahead and grab our heat, and we're just going to put a little heat to this heat shrink, and hopefully those seat nicely. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now I can give these a tug again. It looks pretty good there, so we're going to stick with that. That's looking pretty decent. Now we can go ahead and grab the quad, and I can zoom out a little bit here, back out to show you the full view. And now we can go ahead and start to solder up the positive side here first, and then the negative side, and after that we'll solder on our motors, our motor wires. And it doesn't matter what particular order you solder these on, and I'm going to show you some tricks about this when I do that. So now I'm going to go ahead and zoom back in so you guys can see this a little bit closer up. It doesn't matter what type of ESC, 4-in-1 ESC you have. Most of these terminals on the back of these ESCs look very similar to this. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the Hacko again, and we're going to heat up the wire again first. Like I said before, when we were doing this side, you want to do that first. So go ahead and clean off your soldering iron tip. And these type of repairs are pretty lengthy, but it's not super hard. Now, one thing, if you see that your wire looks a little bit short right here, you can always strip that back a little bit further and give yourself some extra room there with your battery wire. You don't want them to be too short and not make contact with the tab. I'm just going to use the larger side of this right here and kind of make that just a little bit longer. It doesn't hurt to redo things before you get started. What I mean by redoing it is just retinning these wires. It's going to make them a little bit longer. Okay, you don't want them to run forward and make any contact on the chips, but now that I have these a little bit longer, I can go ahead and tin those back up and make sure that those are nicely tinned before I touch them down to the battery terminals. Now, one thing you want to do when you're soldering is make sure that you don't drop any excess pieces of solder onto the top of your ESC boards. that will also cause a short somewhere, because you're probably going to be making a connection with the solder to a really bad point on your ESC or your flight controller. I've seen people drop blobs of solder into motors, onto boards. All kinds of bad scenarios can happen when you're working over top of your quad. So that should be common sense, but sometimes people do make mistakes. And watch out for your wires to start fraying here. You don't want these to fray too much, because we don't want them to make any connections. Now this wire looks like it's getting close to being hot enough. If you get too much on there, just go ahead and wipe it, or wipe it off with your pen tip like that, and clean the tip off again. If it starts to blob on the bottom, which you can't really see it from this perspective, it can happen. Just go ahead and run that tip all the way around. Make sure that the solder is flowing nice. And once that's done, we can go ahead, start heating up that red side first. Okay. And before you do that, it would be a good idea to go ahead and clean off the tip of your TS100 and add some more solder to it. So once you see it start to sizzle a little bit and the wire's hot enough, we can go ahead and push it down on the tab and make contact here with the tab. And I'm going to put this over to the outside edge of this tab, because I'm going to come back and add some heat there to put down the capacitor. And I'm going to do it on the inside of this. So now that looks pretty good there. Everything is nice and hot. It's kind of burning my fingers here holding the wire. So I'm going to let go with the TS100. And that looks like we have a pretty good solder. I could bring this up a little closer and inspect that. Looks like it is sitting flat. That's looking pretty good. Now we can do the next side. And really important to clean your iron off each time. And this is really critical for new guys, that you're not getting any of these wires switched around, meaning having positive on the wrong side or negative on the wrong side. These ESCs are usually clearly labeled positive and negative. If you think you have it wrong, double, triple check this point. I'm going to keep working with this wire again until it's nice and hot and solder melts on the opposite side where the iron is touching the wire. Just going to keep moving this around a little bit. Move your iron around until it gets nice and hot. And when you see that the solder is flowing nicely on the wire and that you don't have a lot of frays sticking out from the side of your wire, just go ahead and keep spinning that wire on the TS100 tip. And this is a nice ESC to work with, mainly because it has a lot of space in between both of these battery terminals. So we're just going to make sure that I make contact with the tab down there and the wire at the same time. If you feel that it's sticking on one side and it's not moving around enough, it means it's not hot enough yet. So the wire should move freely on the tab. And you don't want to do this for too long, because you can separate the tab from the terminal on the ESC, so very important. All right, now we're going to let go there. And I really do need more solder on that, so I'm just going to add quite a bit more solder here. You want to have a nice pull over top of your wire. It should be nice and round over top of your wire. And when you're done, that's not the best one that I've ever done before, but it's going to work. And you're going to look for any frays here. So if you see these little frays sticking out the side, you want to be very careful about those to make sure that they're not making any type of connections. And sometimes you might have one coming off the back side, and you just pull those off with your fingernails or clip them off with a set of snips to make sure all of this is super clean, because any frays and make any connections between each other will short out your quad. It only takes a little tiny fray to screw up your day. So now that's looking pretty good, and we can move on to the next part, which is your motor wires. Okay, so we're gonna start with motor number 1 here, and you can see there's a number 1 there, number 2, number 3, and number 4. So you don't really have to do this in any particular order, but just to be a little bit OCD, I'm gonna do it this way. And if you want to, you can go around the backside like this. If you have enough wire, you can go around the backside. If not, you can go in the front. If you want to be super OCD, you could put this from coming in from the bottom and solder these up on the bottom. If you're not worried about it, just do them on the top. And you're going to heat up the terminal and the wire at the same time. You can hold it with your fingers if you're a tough guy. And you're going to let that seat for about 5 seconds, and you're going to give it a tug. If you don't want to be a tough guy, you can always use some tweezers, because the tweezers actually work pretty well. Just take a second to get set up there. Make sure I move all the rest of the wires out of the way. This wire wants to be in the way. So I'm going to take this next one, clean off the tip, add some more solder. Once you get a little workflow going, you can kind of just rock these out. And you want to make sure that when you're using your tweezers that you have the wire flush with the tab. And it's kind of cool to come in from the inside like this. This is going to take some patience. That way you don't have wires hanging out on the outside. And a lot of times I move my iron out toward the outside edge, and I'm just going to tug on this one time to make sure it's properly soldered on. And now we're going to work on the next wire here. Okay, so we have the third wire. Clean off the tip again, add some more solder, and try not to do that right over top of your boards, your ESCs. And we're going to apply some heat to the terminal and the wire at the same time, and that's looking pretty awesome. So I'm going to move the tip away from the terminal like that so I don't get a shark fin going up. Okay, that looks pretty cool. And now I can do the next one. And this is the one that's going to be on the front of your setup, so this might be a good time to go ahead and just grab your camera wherever your camera is sitting on your bench, because sometimes the sidewalls can get in the way and of your setup, and that means that your wires could get crunched when you go to put your quad back together. So make sure that you have the correct setup there and that you're not smashing any of your wires. That's going to be super important. So I'm going to move my helping hands out of the way, and let's go ahead and check that out. So I'm just going to put this down just like this, and so it looks like I'll be able to run it around this way, just like we did on the other one, around the post. And the shorter wire here is not going to make it around the post, so I'm going to set my camera over to the side. That looks like it'll be fine if I run them just like that. Okay. And the two longer wires will make it around the post so I can be fancy. And we're going to do the shortest one first in the bunch. So we're going to work from this side over like this. I'm just going to come in just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my iron. I'm going to clean that off again. Put some more solder on there, just a little tiny amount, and go ahead and heat up the wire. And you want this wire to sit flat on the terminal. And you want both of these pieces of metal to be hot enough at the same time so that a pull occurs. Now go ahead and drag off to the outside edge and let that sit there for 5 seconds or so. And now we're going to go ahead and push that wire back down on the frame. Just kind of tuck that down in there. Now we're going to grab the next one over, and for this one I'm going to use the tweezers So I'm going to clean off the tip again. We're going to touch a little bit of solder on the tip, get that nice and ready. And now if you bend the wire up a little bit, that will help you get it flat on the terminal, on the pad. Now also I'm going to go ahead and take one of the standoffs and put on here, because I want to make sure that I have enough room to get all the way around this terminal, or this standoff. This is going to be important that I have enough length, because I did here, but these wires might have been trimmed differently, and I didn't trim these wires originally, so I just want to make sure that I have enough length here, which it looks like I do, to be able to come around the inside. Takes a little bit of time, and if you have to, you can try to use your fingers, but I recommend using the tweezers. And this can be tedious doing it this direction. You want to come in from the top with your tweezers on the back like that, and once you have it set right, go ahead and squeeze your tweezers and make sure that your wire makes contact with the terminal. So push that wire down with the TS100 tip and pull away from your solder, and pull your tweezers out of the way. Give it a little tug there. That looks good. Make sure that there's no solder touching in between these terminals, really important. So now I'm going to take my next wire, and I'm going to come in from an angle like that, come in from the back side here, and grab this as hard as I can. I'm going to go ahead and add some more solder on the tip here, and we're going to try to get this held down here. And it never hurts to do things twice. If you think that you don't like the way this looks, you can always go back and do it again. Now pull off to the outside edge, and now we have one side done. So all three of those should look nice and shiny. If they don't look nice and shiny, you want to do them over again. If you see that it looks kind of dull, so those look decent. Now we can start on the other side over here. I'm going to go ahead and clean off the tip again, spin the quad around, and now I can do this other side. And after that, we can put the standoffs on this side, and we can go ahead and actually I'm going to do that right now before I run the wires around, make sure I have the right links. And put this first one on here. Be careful not to burn these when you're soldering your wires on. If you have the TS100, it helps a lot, because the tip on this TS100 is actually small enough to fit most terminals on flight controllers and on ESCs. It's almost like they were made for race quads. So go ahead and clean the tip again, put some solder on there, choose my shortest wire first. My shortest wire is going to come in on that first tab on the outside. And we're going to make sure that I'm getting heat to the wire and to the tab at the same time. Once I see it pull up, I can pull my soldering pin away from it, and then I get a nice round ball. You don't want any shark fins sticking up, because shark fins can sometimes cause problems. That's not good. Let's see there. Okay. So now we're going to come around the back side, clean the tip off again, add some more solder. Okay, we're going to come in on like this, and this one might be too short. Nope, it'll fit. Okay, so we're going to get some heat on both of those. When I feel it start to burn my finger, I know it's getting quite hot enough, and I can pull it away. And if it moves on you, you want to do it over, because it just moved on me right then. So we're going to do this over. So go ahead and take it back off, and it should look nice and shiny, just like that. The motor wires don't take long to do. That's the great thing about these motor wires. Okay, so we're going to come in from the back side like that. Be careful that you're not putting any pressure on the chips on the top of your ESC board with your tweezers, because these tweezers can break chips or damage things on the board. So be very careful when you're using tweezers in this situation. Okay, and remember, you can sort of change the angle that you're putting your wire down with your tweezers, and that'll make it touch that ESC tab. It's very important that you touch the tab. So pull away like that. So now we have 3 of those wires hooked up. We're good to go there. So now we can do the last one. We're all the way to the last solder point. This is awesome. We're moving right along here. Okay, we're going to spin that all the way down, all the way down. This is a very tall bolt going through here, but this works perfect for what we're doing, because this one has the harness here, and we don't have to push things down and seat it on there. I'm talking about the pin plugins that some types of these ESC flight controller combos have. So we're looking for the shortest wire here again. The shortest wire in the pack is this one. And I'm going to come in from this side over here. I'm just going to do it with my fingers. I'm going to put a little more solder on here. We're going to heat up the wire first, and then I'll drop it down on the tab. Try to get some heat to the tab. Cool thing about these motor wires, they really don't take a whole lot of time to heat up. I got a little bit of a shark fin there. I'm OCD about those shark fins, so I'll pull that to the side. That's not too bad. We can give that a tug. We can tuck that back up in there next to the quad there. And we're going to run the next wires around. So I'm trying to get this to the point where you guys can see it. Clean the tip off one more time. Hit it with some solder. Okay, you're going to do the next wire here. Moving right along, trying to get this finished up so we can get to the next point in this video. You guys can see that is looking pretty nice right there. Okay, and we're going to do the next one. I've got enough solder on the tip of my iron to do this next part for you. Okay, that's looking pretty awesome, pretty juicy. All right, we'll pull these down, and that is looking pretty good. We have all of our motors are now soldered to each respective tab, and now we can take our flight controller, turn off your iron, unplug your battery from a TS100, and we're going to go ahead and grab the Airbus F4 here. Pull this out of the package, and let's get a little bit wider view there for you. So next, if you have them, go ahead and put your grommets on the posts, because we're going to dampen the space between the ESCs to where your flight controller is going to be seated. And what you're going to do first, guys, is you're going to go ahead and plug in your ESC harness before you go to the next part, after you get all these grommets on there. Okay, so we're good to go there, and you want to make sure that you put this on the correct way, and it looks like our ESCs are on there properly. Like I said, 1, 2, 3, and 4 there. Just double check all that all the time. So now I've got the grommets down. I can go ahead and seat this down, but before I do that, I'm going to plug in the harness. So I'm going to plug them in. It looks like they go teeth side up. Make sure that's nice and tight. Now I'm going to pull it this way and put my finger down right here, and I'm just going to tuck those in underneath like that, so you don't have any harness wires hanging out toward the camera. That looks nice and neat. There's a little bit of space there. If you want to, you can use your dampeners that came along with the Airbus F4. That might be a good idea to do that. So we'll go ahead and pull those out of the package, because there is a little bit of room. Same thing with the ESC. If the ESC, I believe, came with some dampeners. No, maybe I've set those to the side. If it came with dampeners, go ahead and put your dampeners inside these holes, because these holes are actually a little bit larger to accommodate their own dampening. And these are pretty awesome. Just getting them in there is a little bit of a trick. You can do it with your fingernails. It might be a little quicker to give it a little screwdriver tab there. Push it through. All right. And the next one. And if you want to pull off the grommets that you just put down and use these instead, you can totally do that, or you can leave them down there. And for this board, I think I'm actually going to leave them down there and leave those grommets, dampening grommets, underneath these, even though these grommets are here. These grommets on the flight controller are pretty much for just making sure that this is seated nicely. Okay, now we're going to push this through there with the screwdriver through to the bottom. Now there's 3 of them. And we're going to do the last one here. Just pinch the bottom of it until it goes through that little tiny hole. Okay, and now it looks good. And now we're going to go ahead and touch that wire again with your finger, tuck that underneath, and we're going to push this through. If it looks like it's not going through on one side, just check your dampeners. There we go, that looks pretty good, but I don't like the way the harness looks. Let's go ahead and do that again. All right, that looks pretty good there. So you want your arrow to be facing forward. Your USB should be to the side right there. And now I'm pretty much ready to go ahead and I can add my next standoff above it if I want to. If I want to add some type of VTX setup where I'm going to have it mounted on the 3rd level up top, that will allow you to do that if you're going to do it like that. Or you can just rest your VTX up here, maybe run a zip tie around it. Depends on what your VTX setup looks like. And I'm still deciding which VTX we're going to add on this. So we might use this Force one here that came with it, but it does have a bit of a harness already set up here. So I could just solder those 3 tabs on right there and plug things in and make it nice and easy. So now I'm going to grab another standoff, just one on the opposite side over there, and go ahead and put that on the opposite side. I'm going to leave these other 2 off for now. So you're pretty much about 3/4 of the way done with your repair. This is looking pretty nice here. And if you want to, you could put your camera in on the front here, but that might just fall off. Just leave that to the side. Now before we get too far along, if you want to, in your particular setup, you can add this capacitor and you can just snip this off so that they're both equal, because these come a little bit longer on the positive side for some reason. So I usually just snip them off until they're equal, and snip that off well away from your quad, because you don't want any little tiny pieces of metal touching your quad's electronic components there. Let's go ahead and turn on the Hacko again. We're going to turn on the fume extractor, and I'm going to go ahead and tin up both of these. Going to plug in the TS100 here, get that nice and hot, and clean off the tip. First I'm going to let it heat up. So what do you guys think about this build so far? Not too hard. Hopefully you're to the point now where this video has helped you get your ESCs back on there, this new Airbus flight controller. And this Airbus is really a good flight controller. That's why I chose the HGLRC Airbus for this particular build. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and sort of lightly tin up both of these. And you can cut these just a little bit shorter if you want to. Now what I usually do with these is I take my needle nose pliers, and I'm just going to show you how this works real quick. And what I do is I bend the tip of each wire, and I bend it so that they're flat and facing sort of what would be the horizontal point. So it's going to rest flat. When we solder this on, we want it to sort of stand up a little bit like that off the back. And that way it'll be nice and flat. It just makes things a little bit easier. Now you're going to take your red side first and do that. If you don't have it labeled, it should be labeled on the side of your capacitor. But this one's clearly labeled red on this side. Sometimes they're black and black there.
So we're going to add a little bit of solder. We'll go ahead and clean the tip off again and do that over to the side. And I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of heat down there to that. And actually, you know what? I'm going to do this a different way. I'm going to straighten that out. And I'm going to hold it down with my pin. I'm going to hold the capacitor down with my pin and come back in with some solder over top of that. And you're just going to make sure that it gets seated in that blob of solder right there. You don't need to heat it all the way up so that it moves your battery terminal wire. If that does happen, it's not the end of the world, but all we're doing here is just making a light connection so that everything is powered up together. Okay, just like that. Once you get one side done, it's pretty easy to get the rest on there. So that's looking pretty good. Now that capacitor is well out of the way of anything in here, and I could actually tuck it back up inside here if I want, depending on what's going on up here. We're going to have our antenna coming out the back here, so we might leave that down like that, or we can bring it down below. But we'll see about that when we get everything else soldered up. So the next step you guys are going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to grab your camera, and we're going to work with the camera next. The camera and the VTX setup. I usually like to do that before I do the receiver. I don't know why. We could do the receiver right now, but we're going to work with the camera. So we're going to go ahead and spin this around so you can see it from the front here. And they had already soldered up some things here for this camera harness. And I do have some other VTXs sitting over here. I have some AKK VTXs that I could add on this stack. I have a really sweet AKK like 1000 milliwatt transmitter setup with a built-in DVR, so I can record straight to a DVR with a micro SD card, or I could use the I have a smaller one that I could just heat shrink and put on top of this stack if I wanted to. It's a 20 by 20, or I could use this one. The quick way would be to use this one because it does already have this plug for the camera. And I can also I could snip these and show you guys how to do this. This might be the better way to do it, just so you guys are on the same page there with everything. So if you have some type of camera, it's going to be some type of run cam or Fox ear camera. I'm assuming most of us are flying Fox ear and run cam camera setup. So I'm going to go ahead and snip this right in the middle here, because the way that these flight controllers hook up, you don't need to do it the way that they did it there. And whatever VTX you have, you want to make sure that you look at the guide and you know what all these wires are before you start soldering things up. Typically, the yellow one right here is going to be your signal wire, and that's going to go to your VTX signal tab. We're just going to pinch that off, and we'll probably going to go ahead and solder that up to that next part. And then your power for your VTX is going to be your red wire, and the ground one is going to be your black wire. So we're just going to snip all those off right there, and we'll tin those up. And make sure you do that away from your setup when you're tinning these up so you don't drop any excess solder on there. And judging by the way they have this one set up, and if I bring this a little bit closer to the camera here, I'm just looking at this. This is 7 to 24 volt, so I can run that straight to probably any of the VTX terminals there on the board. So the video wire is that yellow one, and we have 5 volt out, and this is these two 5 volt outs, and the main power on here is actually going to be the ones at the very bottom right here. So this is 7 to 24 volt, and that's going to be the power in right there on this particular VTX. So a lot of times on the VTXs you only have 3 wires, and you also sometimes, if you have smart audio, you have an extra wire there for your smart audio wire. It's going to go down to your flight controller. So this looks pretty good here. Now let's go ahead and we'll tin these up, and we'll get this soldered on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and heat up the TS100 again. Just press that button on your TS100, When you get up over 250 degrees, you can start to clean off the tip and add a little bit of solder on the tip of your iron. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of solder on there first. We're at 226, so we should start to melt right about now. Right about 225 you can start to melt and clean off the tip. So we're going to go ahead now and going to twist all these wires one by one to make sure that they're nice and tight. And we're going to tin those up and get those ready to put down on the flight controller. Tin this one up. It's your black wire, your negative wire, and your positive wire right there, your power wire. And what you want to do is go ahead and solder these 3 wires to your right hand side of the flight controller. I'm going to show you this a little bit closer up and get this centered up here for you. And we're going to zoom right into those terminals. Now you're going to take a little bit of solder and we're going to do the positive side right here. We're going to do the VTX signal wire terminal, and we're going to do that negative terminal there. So we're going to come in from the inside. If these wires that you snipped with your fingers are a little bit too long, you can take your snips and actually trim these back. But again, like I said, don't trim these right over top of your assembly. You don't want any metal parts flopping around inside your build. Okay, so now I have those, and I'm going to start with the positive wire, so that's going to be your red wire. Just go ahead and clean off your tip again. And I'm going to go ahead and get that seated. Just come in from the inside so we don't have wires hanging off the outside of the stack. Okay, it looks like my iron turned off. Okay. Now that looks pretty good. I had enough heat there to do that. You only need to touch these on the terminals for a split second, not super long time. So now we're going to do the signal wire. Okay, just get a good grab on it with your fingers there, and if you don't get it the first time, just try to hold it nice and still and use that flat side of your iron. And then come up just like that. You can also go out to the side to try to get that perfect little bubble. Now clean off the tip again and go ahead and grab the negative wire on your harness, and we're going to do the negative wire here, your ground wire. That's looking pretty good. So all of those are soldered up, and now we have this little harness right here we can plug into the VTX. And the way they had this before was they had these wires powering the camera, but we don't need to do it that way this time. Okay, now go ahead and you can plug this in a little bit later. We can just move these wires to the side. Now we're going to go ahead and tin up where your camera is going to go. So your 5 volt here, ground wire here. Add a little more solder there. Make sure that your iron is nice and flat on that tab. If you think you have too much solder, it's really important to make sure that you clean off any excess solder when you're doing these smaller tabs like this. If you get a little bit of a shark's fin, you can kind of do it over. And that's looking pretty good there. So now I can grab the battery camera harness, and a lot of these are the same way. They're just 3 wires, so we're just going to pinch these off here. I'm actually going to use some snips, and we have plenty of length here to make this work. And we're going to pinch each one of these off. It's looking pretty good. Okay, and now you can tin those up. Once you tin those up, we can solder those down to the board. Gonna move that to the side a little bit here. And this might be where you want to grab your helping hands and just bring your helping hands in for tinning these up. Make sure it's far enough away from your quad that you're not dropping any hot solder onto your boards. Okay. And go ahead and tin all 3 of these. It only takes a second. Pretty quick. I'm going to do that. You get a little bit of excess, just go back in with your iron and pull it off and clean off the tip again. So now we are ready to solder on these 3, and we're going to come in from this direction. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom back in for you. We're going to do the one on the far right first. It's going to be your 5-volt. Make sure that these aren't touching any other tabs. We're going to do the video wire next. Okay. Looking good. And now we're going to do the negative wire, your ground wire right here. And if this is not flowing right, that means you don't have enough solder on the tip of your iron. You just add a little bit more there and it should flow nice. And you can kind of come up in a way, and that's looking pretty good. I don't like the way that looks, so I'm going to do that over. Don't be afraid to do things over. It might save your quad. It's pretty important that these are good. Okay, so I'm just going to give that a little bit of a tug there. Everything looks good there. It's looking pretty good. So now we have the camera and the VTX soldered on, and now we can do the S-Bus setup for our receiver. So go ahead and grab your receiver wire. You want that yellow wire. We're going to do the red wire and the black wire just like we did on the other ones. And your S-Bus is down on this rail right here. So we're going to go ahead and clean off the tip again. We're going to put a little bit of solder here, a little bit of solder here, a little bit of solder here. Okay. So now we're going to come around the inside again. We're going to work from the inside out. We don't want wires hanging off the side of the quad. So I'm going to do the S-Bus one first. That's that yellow wire. Now we're going to do the negative wire, which is the black wire, the ground wire. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to pull the pin off the side. It looks like it kind of jumped up there. Okay, that's looking pretty good. All right. Now we want to do the 5-volt wire there. It's looking pretty good. Now the receiver is soldered up. So we can clean off the tip again and unplug the wire for the next step in the build process. Now we're going to go ahead and take this teeth up and plug it into the back of the camera. And I have that little extra connector there for camera control for this Foxeer Micro Predator. Now I'm going to go ahead and seat this down on the front of the quad. And those should snap through on the bottom. Should see them come through on the bottom there. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And now you're going to plug in your VTX. Go ahead and grab your VTX. And if I want to, I can take my receiver and probably squeeze it in between here. I might have enough space to be able to do that. Just underneath there. But I think I'm just going to leave it, probably going to put it on top of that. You can also put it in between the ESC and the flight controller down bottom here. But I do need one more standoff, and I've got one more standoff over here. Don't forget your final standoff there. And I've actually got 2 more standoffs to put on, so go ahead and grab this one over here on this side. And put that one down. Just gonna move this control wire over there out of the way, and I'm gonna go ahead and now we're gonna plug in the VTX, and it's going to be pins up on this particular VTX. So I'm going to plug that in. I'm going to tuck that under here. It's all looking pretty good there. Now, depending on what type of setup you have, you might need this MMCX connector in the very back, facing the back, because this way my button's going to be on the very front right there. You can also turn it to the side and have your button on the side, which might be a little bit better setup. You'll just basically have it running like this around that post right there. So you could, like the way I have this one set up, it's going to come down the back and around like this and snap right in, just like this. That looks like a better way to run this. And then I can find a place for my receiver, and I might be able to just put that right up in there like that, and I'll still be able to get to the bind plug. And we're going to bind this up before we put everything down permanently. So that's looking pretty good right there. And the way we're going to put this down is a little bit of VHB. You're going to need some VHB for your builds. This stuff is awesome. You can get this at Home Depot. Just cut yourself off a little piece of it right here, just like this, a little sliver. And I usually take a razor blade and try not to touch it too much with your fingers, because it doesn't stay very tacky when you touch it with your fingers. For some reason the adhesive doesn't work as good. So we're going to go ahead and pull that back. Try to hold onto the corner there. And if you get a little too much, you could always just trim it back off. But we're going to put it on like that, and we're going to stick it underneath there, because I do have a little bit of room there to where it's not pushing on it too much. That looks pretty good. Now I can take one of my standoff nuts there and put it on the top and secure it down. Okay. I'll do the opposite side. And that's looking pretty good. So now we should have a repaired quad. What you're going to do next is put on your smoke stopper and make sure that everything is okay with your solder joints. Very important that you don't have the white smoke coming out of your quad when you plug it in. If you don't use a smoke stopper, you won't know that you have a short, because it won't light up and let you know things are bad. And if things are bad, just take your time and go ahead and locate that source where you have some solder bridging, and just go ahead and redo things. I had someone yesterday have that issue, and a little bit of troubleshooting by email with some photos, and we saw some issues there. I also told him to unseat all of the motor tabs and do them all over again. And sometimes you have to do that. But it's better to redo things than mess things up the first time by plugging it in wrong. So that's looking pretty good there. Now we have a repaired quad, and I can bind it up to my FR Sky transmitter. I'm just going to make sure all this is seated properly. I'm going to take care of this wire right here. We're going to secure that to make sure that's not shorting out anywhere. And we are done with this quad repair. You're also going to test all of your motors inside Betaflight with your props off to make sure that all of your motors are spinning the right direction. Super important that you do that. I still have these 4 M3 bolts over here to put on the top of the quad, but at this point, that's pretty much all I have left to do. Secure this wire here. We're going to put another zip tie around this on the back to secure it to the back of the arm of the quad. So if my battery gets yanked off the quad, it's not pulling directly on those ESC tabs there, because this will pull directly off and completely destroy your 4-in-1 ESC. So very important that you zip tie that off. But now we're good to go with that repair, and hopefully this build video helped you guys build, and total build, tear down and repair video for you guys from start to finish. Right there we have a quad that's going to now fly again. So I appreciate you guys watching the Drone Camps channel. If you want to hit me up on my Patreon down below, or comment down below to get entered in for the video for the end of the month. November 2nd is coming up quick, guys. we're going to give away that Baby Hawk R and that IH3. Super excited about that, and can't wait to tell you who the winners are for those. So make those comments, and please keep supporting me on Patreon, guys, because it really helps me continue making these awesome videos for you guys. I appreciate all your efforts watching the videos as well, and hopefully my information is helping you guys out. I'm Justin Davis, guys. Peace out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.